Good evening, and welcome to the midweek service of Calvary Baptist Church. Glad to have you with us this evening. As we think about the modern world, that is the world that's kind of built on scientific expertise of technology that has been able to take advantage of laws of physics and laws of nature to exercise human will over the powers of the world, and discovering great power of how we've been able to make internal combustion engines and jet engines, and then harness the power of electricity, and then the powers needed to make electricity, whether they be fossil fuels or hydroelectric power, like the turbines that are run by Niagara Falls, the power of that river, or whether it's nuclear power or whatever power, mankind has learned how to use great powers. With all of those powers, a great good can be done, but of course power can be easily negative. Those things that bless us and make us effective and efficient and enable us to do amazing things also can cause great destruction. And that all those powers that run electricity and all the appliances we have, or the cars and the trucks and the airplanes that we fly in, all that power could be used negatively as well as positively. The greatest power in the world, or at least possibly the greatest power in the world, might be the power of communication, might be the power of the tongue. That for all the things that we have been able to control, we are not always so able to control the communication that causes great harm. Harm in personal friendships, personal relationships, harm between husbands and wives, harm between parents and children and parents, between neighbors, between colleagues at work or management and employees, or whether they be powers between neighborhoods and communities, whether they be interactions between great groups of people like is represented in governmental forces. That words have tremendous power for both good and for harm. James is very interested in helping and is committed to helping his church. And there's many conflicts in the church churches that he's writing to. And his concern is to get at the root of some of their problems. And of course, one of the problems that affects almost every group is the tensions between rich and poor. And we've seen that displayed in the book of James, the tensions between the haves and the have-nots, and the blame and the accusations that can easily go back and forth between them. James also addresses those problems from a different avenue, and that is the cause of problems by the use of words, by the use of language. And when we turn the page from James chapter 2 to James chapter 3, we enter this issue of the importance and the difficulty of controlling our words, controlling our communication. This, I think, is especially significant and important to us in these months that we've been going through, where political things seem to be everywhere, and political things, of course, are driven by words. And we've also been living through a couple decades now, but especially the last decade, of intensification of communication through social media, through online media, where it's a lot easier to communicate hard things without paying the personal cost of face-to-face communication. And so our language has been increasingly coarse and increasingly harsh and increasingly not thoughtful, maybe because we don't have the people in mind because we can't see them. The people that might be reading or hearing the things that we are saying or writing. James wants his people, and he wants all of us. God, through James, wants us to be very careful with our words, very careful with our communication, because words can be a very deadly power. They can cost lives. And so we ought to be thoughtful and guarded. Or James' favorite word here is to be bridled. To put a restraining force upon something to keep our words from causing great harm. Well, if you look with me at James chapter 3, we're going to be looking at the first 8 verses of this. If you could take your Bible, I'll read through James chapter 3, verses 1 through 8. Begins with James' affectionate and common expression of his love for his people, a very Jewish expression. Brethren, my brethren, let not many of you become teachers, knowing that we shall receive a stricter judgment. For we all stumble in many things. If anyone does not stumble in word, he is a perfect man, able also to bridle the whole body. Indeed, we put bits in horses' mouths, that they may obey us, and we turn their whole body. Look also at ships. Although they are so large and are driven by fierce winds, they are turned by a very small rudder wherever the pilot desires. Even so, the tongue is a little member and boasts great things. See how great a forest as a little fire kindles. And the tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. The tongue is so set among our members that it defiles the whole body and sets on fire the course of nature and is set on fire by hell. For every kind of beast and bird, of reptile and creature of the sea is tamed and has been tamed by mankind. But no man can tame the tongue. It is an unruly evil, full of deadly poison. So, James is warning. His warning about the tongue, his warning about words, his warning to be careful as we speak. Now, we shouldn't be naive here when James is talking about the tongue. In our world, we need to also think about the power of fingers and of clicking, and all those things have a power about them that fit in James' category here of the tongue, that is communication. James picks up on the tongue because it plays into some of the analogies he uses of it being a fairly small member of the body, but able to do much bigger things in controlling and even damaging our whole body, our whole life. But he is talking about communication in whatever form it might be. He begins with a warning about teachers. And I don't mean to overlook the literalness of the phrase, let not many of you become teachers. But if we read verse 1 in the context of the whole chapter, James doesn't seem to be talking to a particular class of people called teachers, or an office, or a special group. Seems to me he is talking about people that are playing the role of a teacher, people that are taking authority upon themselves, that they are making claims, that they may not have the office of teacher, but they have the tone or the attitude sometimes when the teacher steps out of the room to go retrieve something. One of the students might play the teacher and decide they're going to be in charge. And I get the sense that's what James is talking about here. Let not many of you start playing at wisdom. Let not many of you start thinking, I'm the wise one here, and I'm going to tell you the way it is. I'm the one who knows. I'm the one who is going to inform you about how this goes. It's interesting sometimes in human conversation, I've noted over the years that sometimes the least amount of wisdom dominates the conversation. I don't know if you've ever had that around your table in your house, but those that seem to know the least are the loudest or the hardest to get under control. And I kind of get the feeling that's what's happening in James's church, is that the elders or the seasoned, the people that have experienced life seem to be taking a backseat to those that are going to explain the way it is, and they know what's wrong. They know what's wrong with the rich. They don't share their possessions. Or I know what's wrong with the poor. They don't work hard enough, and they're lazy. Or I know what's wrong with politicians. Or I know what's wrong with the populace. And so people get up and start talking. My conservative leanings get me to think in terms of continuums that whenever you face problems, they're so big and complex, you're basically trying to trade off and not make things worse when you're trying to make them better, because things are hard. And as soon as people start saying, I know what we need to do, we just need to pass this one law, or we need to be this one thing, I kind of chuckle to myself, well, they haven't been reading too much history of how many times those little simple things have not worked. Your best hope is to not make things worse, right? How hard it is to actually make things better. You have to work at it and try something and be willing to change. But anyway, it seems to me James is talking to people who are thinking, I know what's wrong with you. I know what's wrong with the world, and they're going to tell everybody. They're going to get on Facebook and they're going to post, or they're going to get on their microphone, or they're going to get a TV. One of the great things about the modern world is how cheap it is to communicate. And it's been hard for the old communication institutions, the press, and it used to take millions of dollars to make an Encyclopedia Britannica. And you'd need experts to do it. Now anybody with a couple of dimes can get on and be an expert in anything. I think James would have some interesting things to say about people of our age that we want to be wise, or we think we know. I think James is saying we too readily think we know what we're talking about. We too readily believe we have the answers. Or at least about a particular issue. We read a book, or we heard a message, or we watched a TV program, and now we know. And we're going to tell the world. And of course, there's a certain pride in being the one who knows. There's a certain kind, I'm not sure whether we think there's some award for the person that has it all figured out or says the right thing. But we too readily believe that we know. I have to admit, I share the frustrations of many of, somebody that's really good at something starts playing like they're good at everything. Bill Gates was a brilliant computer scientist. What he knows about world populations, I have less assurance that he's an expert in those things. But we all perhaps have a tendency to think that we know, and people should listen to us. We can get very prideful in our communication. That can happen in personal relationships, where we think we know what's wrong with our spouse, or we think we know what's wrong with our children, or we think we know what's wrong with our parents, and so we're going to become the teachers. We're going to know. I open James 3 with a little trepidation because I teach for a living. My church pays me to teach, so that's one of the things they pay me for. So I speak with a little reticence and embarrassment, because it's very easy for me to go on and talk, and what a challenge it is to be careful about playing the wise, to be too full or too arrogant in our positions. Teaching requires a lot of humility, a lot of restraint in words, and perhaps correction after our words, and not being a know-it-all. James is saying that we should be reticent to instruct. Let not many of you become teachers. Be reticent to think that you're going to fix things with words. It's not that we should never do it. It's not that we don't need teachers. It's not that no one knows what they're talking about, but we should be reticent to do it. One of my favorite stories from church history is the story about Thomas Aquinas, a brilliant scholar. He just seemed to know everything, and his books are extremely erudite and big, and he seemed to write about everything of his day, philosophy and science and ethics and all those things. Thomas Aquinas' nickname was the dumb ox. How did he get the name the dumb ox? Well, it turned out that Thomas Aquinas had studied from his earliest years. He was a reader, voracious reader, and thinker. He would think things through. And he went to what we might call a seminary now, and they're in this class, and the professor is lecturing, and the professor would stop and ask a question. And he would ask, Thomas, what do you think of this? And Thomas Aquinas would think, well, let's see, I read 16 books upon this when I was 15 years old, and I wrote outlines about them. And let's see, which books do I think my professor remembers and has read? Plus, all these other people haven't read this yet, so how can I express this in a way that my fellow students should understand? And meanwhile, 45 seconds have gone by. And so everybody thought he was stupid because it would take him so long to talk. Well, James would appreciate that. I think James, so they nicknamed him the Dumb Ox. Now it was kind of a playful title because after a while people realized he's not dumb, although he was 350 pounds, so he was kind of the ox. But he was slow to speak. He was reticent to just speak, and I think we could learn from that. If somebody as smart as Thomas Aquinas would be very slow to speak, James would say, you should too. You should be slow to speak as well. This isn't the first time in James we've heard this admonition. Remember back in chapter 1. In fact, you look at James 1, verse 19. So then, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. And then down in verse 26, if anyone among you thinks he is religious and does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his own heart, this one's religion is useless. You see, this is a favorite topic. It's clearly an issue in James' church, that people are talking too much, and maybe too harshly. Maybe they're making judgments. Maybe they're blaming people. You can just kind of, just watch the world. You can probably imagine what James was seeing in his own church. And he's urging his church to be more reticent, to be a lot slower to make these judgments, be more thoughtful, to listen more than just to make claims or accusations. James says the reason is that people that talk too much will receive a stricter judgment. People that claim to be teachers, now it only makes sense because people that teach, people that have influence, they're influencing a lot of people's lives and destinies. So people that are public speakers, people that have influence will have a stricter judgment because their words, their communication matter more. Now, if that was true in the first century, how much true in our world of easy access to public communication? If, whatever they could speak in an amphitheater or yell the camels bellowing and things like that in that day, how much easier, how much more important it is for us who can broadcast to thousands easily to be careful, because our words, our claims can cause harm, and God will judge us more strictly because our influence, the level of damage that we could do, can be so much greater. So beware of playing the guru, the wise, and to be reticent, especially to be thinking through what impact might this have. Now, of course, that's true in small settings as well, whether it's the school classroom or the home environment or the workplace coffee room. We ought to be careful because those who talk a lot are going to have a stricter judgment. James goes on to say that the reason this is because this is so important is that right communication is really hard for us. Look at verse number 2. For we all stumble in many things. If anyone does not stumble in word, he is a perfect man, able also to bridle the whole body. So James is saying, you especially need to listen to this and take this seriously, because getting hold of your communication is very hard. It's difficult to do. If you think it's easy, you haven't thought very much about it. And he starts off by saying, what we are really good at is failing. We fail at all different kinds of things. We don't drive the nail straight. We don't make the cookies without burning them. We don't get all the dust off of our shelves. We get our math problems wrong. We misspell words. We have all kinds of difficulties in our work or in our home life. And so probably, James seems to have a little pessimistic view of human nature. You can kind of get the sense he's had some trouble and he might be up to here with it. So I think he does use some hyperbole in his book. That is, he uses the tools of pushing something to an extreme. But he's onto something. I think if any of us were honest, we'd say we fail a lot. We stumble, he says, in many things. There's many things we do poorly. So we deserve humility. Now, we might have an area that we do something very well. We might have an area of expertise. But James says, those areas are probably only a few areas, and what we're really good at is doing things wrong or stumbling. And that's just generally true of us. To err is human. So, okay, it's a given. But then he says, and communication might be the hardest thing that we do. If we have all this trouble doing these other things, if we have trouble with construction or baking or math work or accounting or whatever our discipline is, sewing, just think that communication might be one of the hardest things that we do. So we stumble in all different kinds of things, but our language, our words, might require perfection. It might require a perfect man. That's how hard it is, and which, of course, perfection we all know is unachievable. It's almost a joke. What do you think? I'm perfect? Well, no, nobody thinks you're perfect. Nobody thinks they are perfect. At least I haven't met too many people, if anybody, thinks they're perfect. So, and communication might be the hardest thing that we do. So, if that's true, we need to be very careful. So he ends verse 2 with this one of his favorite terms for especially our speech or our outflowing of our inner person. If anyone does not stumble in word, he is a perfect man, able also to bridle the whole body. So he brings on this idea of bridling, to restraining something, to getting it under control, to getting something so that it's mastered. And so now that brings up one of James's favorite devices, in that he loves metaphors. He's a brilliant illustrator of his concepts. And so he delves into his rather typical, but here one of his most powerful, series of illustrations about bridling things. And he uses some terms of bridling that evoke, in some ways, two different concepts. On the one hand, he talks about little things that control big things. But then he also has the idea of little things that cause big problems. So those two concepts kind of get wed together here, and he wants us to think about both of them. One of the powers of analogies and illustrations is they can mean more than one thing. They can have multiple meanings. And here he wants to use two different ways to looking at things. These things are little things that control bigger things, so the idea of control or bridling, but also little things that can cause a lot bigger things to happen. And his first one is that of bits in horses' mouths. Verse number 3, indeed we put bits in horses' mouths that they may obey us, and we turn their whole body. See, last evening I put on the movie Seabiscuit, this time period piece about a horse from the Great Depression era, the 1930s. This kind of mid-sized to smaller horse that had been mistreated, that had a pedigree. Its father was a powerful horse, but he was smaller and had some difficulties, and his owners kind of gave up on him and kind of beat him, but it didn't work. And then he had all kinds of trouble and was going to be a no factor until he got a trainer. And this trainer found the magic, kind of that inner resource, and found the greatness in this horse. And, it's one of these horse movies where they get, these horses have this spirit and this power, but the rider is dependent upon being able to get that horse to obey him. And how does that happen? Well, through training, through the bit in the mouth, with just a little tug of pain. The horse doesn't like it, so it turns. And so that powerful horse can be controlled and do powerful things. And so that image of something small with thoughtfulness, with mastery, gets a lot out of a power of it. The second illustration he gives, also a very interesting analogy, is that of the ship industry, of big ships that are driven by winds. In verse number 4, look also at ships, although they are so large and are driven by fierce winds, they are turned by a very small rudder, wherever the pilot desires. So again, you have something with great potential power, but it might just be useless because the power goes whatever way the wind blows, or out of control. It might even dash up against the rocks and endanger the crew. But a fairly small, in comparison to the size of the ship, a very small piece of wood or steel that is appropriately placed and put with guiding cables can guide that ship exactly where the pilot wants it to go, even through hard and fierce winds. So something small that can produce something big and bring it under power, the power under control. Then he changes from a more positive view of something little doing something good that's big to something little that do something very damaging. And that is sparks, a fire. Verse number 5, for even so the tongue is a little member and boasts great things. See how great a forest a little fire kindles. Back in 2012, my family and I had the privilege of driving out west and to Great Sierra, Nevada, to California, to some of the mountain ranges, and to Yosemite Park, and to see the sequoia trees. We also were in Arizona and went to Mesa Verde. And one of the things that we heard a lot about and we saw the evidence of was great fires. Is lightning strikes or some careless campers leave some embers burning, and then the wind catches them, and the next thing you know, thousands and thousands of acres, or hundreds of thousands of acres, are aflame with fire, destroying great forests. And it all starts with something very small. So James says, think about how something very little, but it has an internal power to it that can rage out of control. That fire wants to grow bigger if it just has the right combination of fuel and oxygen, that it can destroy much. And so little sparks can destroy a whole forest. Of course, California's had many of those since, as one of the problems that they face. That leads now to his comparison of these little things to the tongue, or the power of communication, which is small. Verse 6, and the tongue is a fire. This comparison now is brought to completion. He's talking really about the power of the tongue. That words can set uncontrolled blazes. They can incite all kinds of dangerous situations. They can destroy families. They can destroy lives. They can destroy businesses. They can destroy whole countries. It's happened. That words can be very, very destructive. And his point about them is that they seem so small. In fact, more than a few of us are tempted to say, but I only said... And we might even think our words have, little power. And that's kind of his point. We might think they're small, but they can do very big and dangerous things. They can have a huge impact. Verse 6, and the tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. The tongue is so set among our members that it defiles the whole body and sets on fire the course of nature, and it is set on fire by hell. So the tongue can destroy your whole body. The tongue can get you in a lot of trouble. It can get you thrown in jail. If you live in the wrong place at the wrong time, it can get your head cut off. If you're not careful with your tongue, it can destroy your family. It can get people that can even barely stand to see each other anymore. It can divide businesses. It can wreck churches. It can do so much harm. So don't make little of the tongue or communication. Say, oh, but I just thought or I just said. It can ruin your whole life. He says it can set on fire the whole course of nature. It can set the whole world on fire. It's the whole world of humanity on fire. And then he says that it's really fueled by hell. The fires of hell come to mind as he's thinking about iniquity, that the tongue can sin, and sin comes from the devil, and hell is the dominion of the evil one. And so the tongue is kind of can be like a hellfire, set on fire by hellfire. So he's putting this in the most dramatic terms of how serious God takes our words and our communication. So he's already implied this, and now he says it again. He comes back to it. He had implied it, or even said it back in verse number 2, when he talked about bridling the whole body. So now he's talking about, bridling or taming, getting this thing under control. Verse number 7. For every kind of beast and bird, of reptile, and creature of the sea is tamed and has been tamed by mankind. But no man can tame the tongue. It is an unruly evil, full of deadly poison. So his point here is that you've got to get this thing under control. And he's pressing this point because he's had too many people say, oh, yeah, I get it. But he's saying, no, you haven't gotten it yet. You have to really, really work at this. It's going to require taming. And he says that compared to taming wild beasts, which is very hard. I don't know if you ever watch one of these nature shows where they get the lion or the tiger or elephants seem to be a little, even though they're big, easier, but taming those things, it would be a little intimidating. How do you get that elephant to pretend like it stands on your chest but not really hurt you? Or how do you get them to balance on those stools, one on top of the other? How do you get the tiger to jump through the flaming hoop? Or how do you get that snake to do that thing for the TV, the movie shot? Or how do you get cats to do anything they don't want to do? Dogs, I guess, dogs seem to be a lot, because the dogs want to please you. But dogs and all these things, they get to tame. One of my favorite life experiences when they used to have the Sea Lion and Otter show at SeaWorld. And I'd go to that show like 3 or 4 times if we went to SeaWorld, the Sea Lion and Otter show, how they got those otters. And it's almost like they have built-in comedy. Of course, it was the people that were comic, and they get these sea creatures to kind of be comic by playing these roles. And it's always amazing to do. The great whales, the orcas, they get to entertain the crowds. And it's amazing what they can do, and I don't know if I could do it. I mean, you have to be patient. You have to kind of understand these things. But James says, compared to taming the tongue, that's easy. That's easy to do. Lots of people could tame animals. All kinds of people from mankind have tamed wild beasts, and they've done so successfully. But I can't think of that many people that have tamed their tongue, is his point. And comparatively, wild beasts are easier. And so, he says it's impossible. Again, I think he's using a hyperbole. It's not like he doesn't know anyone that has a tame tongue, but it can seem like it's impossible to train our words. And maybe to some extent, even the most trained person sometimes is going to, have a flare-up or let some word or phrase or some idea out of control. But his point is that it takes a lot of work, and it takes a lot of spiritual discipline to do it, and it's something that we need to do because, like a wild lion, our tongue might just tear somebody apart. And so it's a training that has to be done. But he says that our words are poisoned. Now, let's not lose our theology here. It's not like somehow the problem is with our tongue or with our communication formation of words. We know that the problem is from our hearts. Jesus said that out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. So where the poison is and where the hellfire is really is in our hearts, and it gets expressed in our words. So we're really dealing with the root. We need to look at the root. What is it that causes bad communication? What is it that causes us to pretend like we know the answer when in reality, we may be ignorant about something? Well, it's the pride of our heart. And there's nothing that stirs up our pride as much as somebody else's pride. Don't you know it? You were having a fairly good day, but somebody else's pride just strikes you. And your pride rises up to get it. Now, that's the poison he's talking about, that poison of that self-defense, that self-promotion. And it gets put into our words and poisons our communication. So he's addressing this need for God to change our hearts and to give us a foreign wisdom. And of course, the fear of the Lord is that beginning of wisdom, the fear of the Lord that causes us to restrain our words. Well, next time we'll continue with the challenge, but for now, this week, if the Lord would bring us conviction to guard our words, to, if necessary, make them very few, but true and sweet and edifying and designed to bless, rather than to let pride bring us into this, envying and hurting. And how so important for Christians here in this time with political divide to be so careful with our words. People didn't like the way Trump was treated, so they're going to get back at Biden. And the Biden people want to get, back at the Trump supporters, and on. We're going to get this rage. Christians need to be the ones who speak peace, who speak restraint in this time. And of course, that's only one area of our lives. Just think how many areas at home, with your wife or your husband or your children, that you need to measure your words carefully, that we not go against God's command, that we bridle our tongue and bless people rather than to curse them. Be careful with the wielding of the world's most dangerous weapon, the world's most dangerous power, the tongue, before we burn our world to the ground. Let's do our part to put out the fires. Well, if you will join me in the changing of venues over to our Zoom meeting, that we might interact, you joining us on Zoom, and people in the auditorium sharing as well, that we might share requests and encouragement of praises and pray together. Thanks for joining us this evening. Have a good night.